On Mother's Day, my wife and I went to a luxury restaurant for dinner with our son and daughter-in-law. We sat at a corner table watching them order expensive dishes while my wife's hands trembled from illness. My daughter-in-law turned to the waiter and said clearly, "Split the check." "We're not paying for her." My son sitting beside her nodded in agreement. I didn't say a word, but when the bill was brought to the table, I slowly stood up and said one sentence that made my son's face instantly turn pale. "Thank you for being here with me today." Before the story continues, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please share your city or country in the comments. It's always meaningful to see how far these stories travel. Also, some elements are fictionalized for storytelling purposes, but the reflections and lessons may still be worth thinking about. I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw her smile. It was 3 o'clock on Mother's Day afternoon when Kathy and I pulled into the parking lot of Mastro's Ocean Club. My 2009 Honda Civic made that grinding noise again as I shifted into park, the sound of something expensive about to break. I'd been ignoring it for months. We couldn't afford to fix it. That May 12, 2024, Scottsdale, Arizona. The kind of warm evening where the heat hasn't quite let go yet. Around us, glass towers and luxury cars gleamed in the sun. Kathy sat in the passenger seat, wearing her pale blue dress, the one from the thrift store 15 years old, carefully ironed that morning despite her trembling hands. She looked at the restaurant through the windshield. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "It's Mother's Day," I said, squeezing her hand. "You deserve a nice dinner." She didn't argue. That was Kathy, 69 years old, 47 years married to me, and she never complained. Not when I worked double shifts at the fire station. Not when her condition ate through our savings. Not when I told her we couldn't afford her medicine anymore. I helped her out of the car. She moved slowly, favoring her left foot. The ulcer had been there for months. I could see the dark stains seeping through her stocking, but neither of us said anything. The restaurant wasn't open yet, but I'd called ahead. The manager, Miguel, early 50s, kind eyes met us at the entrance. "Mr. Sullivan." He extended his hand. I shook it and pulled out an envelope from my jacket. Inside was $600 in cash, every dollar we had left. Our rent money for May. We were already 2 months behind. "I need you to do something," I said quietly. "Tonight my son and his wife are taking us to dinner. When the check comes, I need you to tell them it's already been paid." Miguel's eyebrows went up. "Prepaid? Yes, this is $600. I don't know what the bill will be, but I'm hoping it's enough. If it's not, just tell them anyway, please." He looked at the bills, then at Kathy standing nearby, then at my old Honda with its scratched paint. His eyes returned to mine. "Why?" "Because I know my son won't pay for his mother," I said, "and I won't let her be humiliated tonight." Miguel was quiet for a moment. Then he tucked the envelope into his pocket. "I'll take care of it. Whatever the total is, if it's more than 600, it's on the house." My throat tightened. "Thank you?" "And happy Mother's Day, ma'am," he said to Kathy. We drove around the block until 6 o'clock. When we returned, a young valet eyed our Honda with barely concealed disdain. I handed him the keys and helped Kathy out. She leaned on me heavily. Then I heard the growl of an expensive engine. A black Porsche Cayenne pulled up behind us, gleaming in the evening light. The vanity plate read, JAYSULLY. My son stepped out, Jason, 46 years old, wearing a suit that probably cost more than our monthly rent. He looked successful, healthy, everything I'd wanted for him. Then she emerged from the passenger side. Amber, 43, blonde, beautiful in that expensive way, designer dress, perfect hair, heels like weapons. She moved like someone who'd never worried about money, but it was her smile that struck me. She looked at us standing there, me in my old sport coat, Kathy in her thrift store dress, and smiled. Not warmly, the kind of smile that said, we didn't belong here. Mom, Dad. Jason hugged Kathy carefully, then clapped my shoulder. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom." Kathy's face brightened. "Thank you, sweetheart." Amber followed, heels clicking. She barely touched Kathy's cheek with her lips. "Hi, Catherine. That's a lovely dress. Vintage, right?" Kathy's smile faltered. "Oh yes, I've had it a while." "I thought so," Amber said, turning to me. "Hank, good to see you." Amber. Inside the restaurant hummed with quiet wealth. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, couples in cocktail attire. Our table was tucked in the corner. Kathy slid into her seat with relief, her hand going to her foot. I saw her wince. "You okay, Mom?" Jason asked. "Just a little tired," Kathy said quickly. Amber was already on her phone. Jason glanced at his wife, then his mother, then shrugged and opened his menu. I opened mine too, though I knew I had to order something small. A salad maybe. Kathy would do the same. We always did. But Amber flipped through the pages with confidence. "Oh my God, they have oysters," she said. "Babe, we have to get the oysters." "Sure," Jason said, not looking up. "And the lobster tail. It's market price, but whatever. Special occasion." Under the table, Kathy's hand found mine. Her fingers were cold and trembling. I squeezed back. The waiter appeared, young, polite, white shirt, crisp. "Good evening. Can I start you with drinks? Bottle of the Camus," Amber said immediately. "The 2019. The waiter nodded and left. Jason leaned back, scrolling his phone. Neither of them had looked at Kathy in 5 minutes. I sat there holding my wife's hand, watching Amber study the menu like she was planning a campaign. She tapped a manicured nail against the page, completely absorbed. The waiter returned with water. Amber didn't look up. "I'll start with the oysters, Rockefeller," she announced. "And the Maine lobster tail for my main." "Excellent choice," the waiter said, writing it down. "Tuna tartare and the Wagyu ribeye." Jason added eyes still on his phone. The waiter turned to Kathy. "And for you, ma'am." Kathy's eyes scanned the prices. I watched her face tighten. $38 for a salad, $55 for pasta. "The French onion soup, please," she said softly. $18, the cheapest item on the menu. "And you, sir?" "House salad," I said. $16. Amber didn't even glance up as the waiter collected our menus. Jason's fingers flew across his screen. Neither seemed to notice that their combined order cost more than Kathy and I spent on groceries in a month. The wine arrived. Amber swirled, nodded approval. 1 bottle more than our electric bill. I looked at my son across the table, at his expensive watch, his tailored suit, his $1,000 phone. I thought about the day 16 years ago when I'd signed over my entire inheritance to him. $2 million from my parents' estate, every cent, because I'd wanted him to have opportunities I never had. Kathy sat very still, hands folded, eyes on the flickering candle. The light caught the silver in her hair, the lines around her mouth, the way her shoulders curved inward. 47 years I'd known this woman, 47 years of struggles we'd faced together. And now we sat in a restaurant we couldn't afford our rent money, already paid to Miguel, watching our son ignore his mother while his wife ordered lobster. The appetizers arrived. Amber attacked her oysters without a word to anyone. Jason cut into his tuna still on his phone. Kathy's soup sat untouched in front of her. Her hand trembled in mine. I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw her smile. But now I was certain. The night was just beginning. Kathy watched Amber eat. That's the first thing I noticed, the way my wife sat perfectly still, her soup cooling in front of her, while Amber lifted an oyster to her lips and tipped it back with practiced ease. 6 of them on that plate. $86 worth of shellfish disappearing in minutes. Jason didn't look up from his phone. The tuna tartare sat half-finished in front of him, a tower of raw fish and avocado that cost more than Kathy's weekly medicine. My iced tea was $4.50. I hadn't touched it yet. Then Amber set down her fork and reached for her purse. Her whole demeanor changed. The board-scrolling phone routine vanished, replaced by something theatrical. She pulled out her phone and turned to Kathy with a smile I didn't trust. "Catherine," she said, her voice suddenly warm in a way that made my skin crawl. "Jason and I have some news." Kathy looked up hopeful. "Oh," Amber glanced at Jason, who finally set down his phone and nodded. Then she turned the screen toward us. "We're pregnant," Amber announced. 14 weeks. On the screen was an image, black and white, grainy, the kind you see in doctor's offices. A tiny curved shape in a sea of gray. The date stamp read 6 weeks ago. Kathy's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God! Oh, sweetheart!" Tears sprang to her eyes. Real tears, the kind that come from somewhere deep. She reached across the table with trembling hands and grasped Amber's wrist. "A baby. Jason, you're going to be a father." "Yeah, Mom," Jason said, a slight smile on his face. "We wanted to tell you in person, on Mother's Day." "That's wonderful," Kathy whispered, her voice breaking. "That's just wonderful." She was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking. She squeezed Amber's hand like she was holding on to a lifeline. "A grandbaby. I never thought... I hoped, but..." Amber patted Kathy's hand once, twice, then gently pulled away and picked up her wine glass. "We're very excited," she said, taking a sip. "When are you due?" Kathy asked, wiping her eyes with her napkin. "Late October," Amber said. "Halloween, actually. Isn't that funny? Have you thought about names? Not yet, it's still early. Do you know if it's a boy or a girl? Too soon to tell. I sat there watching the whole exchange saying nothing. Something about it felt wrong. Not obviously nothing I could point to and say there that's the problem, but wrong nonetheless. The way Amber held her wine glass for one thing. 14 weeks pregnant, and she was drinking Camus like it was water. Maybe that was normal now. Maybe I was just old-fashioned. But Kathy hadn't touched alcohol when she was carrying Jason. Not a drop. And the image on the phone. I'd seen ultrasounds before friends' grandkids, the guys at the station showing off pictures. They all looked similar, sure, but something about this one felt too perfect, too textbook, like a picture from a medical website. But I kept my mouth shut. What was I going to do? Accuse my daughter-in-law of faking a pregnancy at the dinner table? Call my son a liar on Mother's Day? So I sat there and watched Kathy cry tears of joy, while Amber finished her wine and Jason went back to his phone. "You're going to be a grandfather. Hank," Kathy said, turning to me with a radiant smile. "Can you believe it?" "That's great news," I said, forcing the words out. Kathy squeezed my hand. "Our first grandchild. Our first, our only, probably." At 69, with failing kidneys and an ulcer that wouldn't heal, Kathy wasn't likely to see many more milestones, but she didn't say that. She just smiled through her tears and asked Amber more questions about doctors and due dates and nursery colors. And I thought, where did it all go? The money, the $2 million. It hit me like a freight train, the memory of that kitchen table 16 years ago. The papers spread out in front of us, the notary's stamp still wet on the transfer documents. March 2008. It had been 3 weeks since we'd lost my parents. Not lost, that made it sound like they'd wandered off somewhere. They were gone. A semi-truck ran a red light on the I-10, and just like the two people who'd been alive for 70-some years, were gone. The inheritance came through quickly, their house sold, their savings liquidated, life insurance paid out. When the lawyer handed me the final number, I'd stared at it for a full minute without speaking. $2 million. Kathy and I sat at our kitchen table that night, the same table we'd eaten breakfast at for 20 years, the one with the wobbly leg I'd never fixed. Jason was there too. 30 years old, fresh out of business school, full of ideas and ambition. "What are we going to do with it?" Kathy had asked quietly. I'd looked at the papers, at the numbers, at my son sitting across from me. "We're going to give it to Jason," I'd said. Kathy's eyes widened. "All of it?" "All of it." Jason looked up. "Dad, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." I'd slid the papers across the table. "Your grandparents worked their whole lives to leave something behind. They'd want you to have opportunities we never had." "But what about you?" Jason asked. "What about Mom? You could retire. You could—" "We're fine," I'd said. "We've got my pension. We've got the house. We don't need fancy things. But you could start a business, invest, build something." Kathy had reached over and squeezed my hand. "Your father's right," she'd said softly. "This is your chance." The notary had come to our house the next day. I'd signed the papers, transferred every cent. Jason had promised God I remembered his exact words. "I'll make you proud, Dad. I'll build something great with this. I promise." I'd believed him. And now, 16 years later, I sat in a restaurant I couldn't afford watching him scroll through his phone while his wife drank wine and announced a pregnancy I didn't quite believe. Where had the money gone? $2 million. Invested right? That should have been $4 million by now. 5 even. But here we were. Jason in his expensive suit, Amber in her designer dress, and Kathy with $18 soup she couldn't bring herself to eat. The waiter appeared to clear the appetizer plates. Amber's was empty, so was Jason's. Mine, the $4.50 iced tea, was barely touched. Kathy's soup was still full, the cheese on top congealed into a cold, rubbery skin. "Did you not like the soup, ma'am?" the waiter asked politely. "Oh, I'm just full." Kathy lied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "It was lovely." The waiter nodded and cleared it away. Amber was already looking at the main courses section of the menu, her finger tracing down the list of steaks and seafood. "So what's everyone thinking for entrees?" she asked brightly. Kathy's hands were trembling again. She folded them in her lap, trying to hide it. I reached over and covered them with mine. Across the table, Jason was typing something on his phone. He hadn't looked at his mother since the pregnancy announcement, hadn't asked how she was feeling, hadn't noticed the untouched soup or the way her face had gone pale. Amber tapped the menu. "I'm thinking the lobster tail." Of course she was. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard my father's voice from years ago. If you give someone everything, make sure they know what it cost. I'd given Jason everything. And sitting there, watching Kathy's hands shake while Amber ordered more food we hadn't paid for. Yet food I'd already paid for with our rent money, I wondered if he'd ever understood the cost at all. Kathy's trembling hands reminded me of another morning, 8 weeks ago, March 10th, the day I'd driven her to the hospital with her glucose at 450 and climbing. I'd woken up at 6 that morning to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, swaying slightly. Her nightgown was soaked with sweat. When I touched her arm, her skin was clammy and cold. Kathy, she didn't answer right away, just stared at the wall, breathing too fast. I grabbed the glucose monitor from her nightstand, the one we'd bought secondhand because the new ones cost too much. My hands shook as I pricked her finger. The number that came up made my stomach drop. 450. Normal was under 120. Anything over 200 was dangerous. 450 meant her body was eating itself from the inside out. "We're going to the hospital," I said, already pulling clothes from the dresser. "And Hank, we can't afford—" "Now, Kathy, we're going now." I'd helped her dress, half carrying her to the car. She'd thrown up twice on the drive to Phoenix General. I'd held a plastic bag for her while trying to keep the Honda steady on the I-10, praying we'd make it in time. The thing is, it wasn't sudden. The numbers didn't just spike overnight. She'd been rationing her insulin for months since the previous summer, when our insurance lapsed, and we couldn't afford the out-of-pocket cost anymore. $750 a month for the medication that kept her alive. We'd tried. God knows we'd tried. But between the mortgage and the utilities and the property tax, there just wasn't enough. So, Kathy had started cutting her doses, a little less each time, skipping the nighttime injection, telling herself it would be fine, telling me it would be fine. It wasn't fine. And I'd let it happen, because 1 week before, March 3rd, exactly 7 days before that terrible morning, I'd sat in Dr. Morrison's office and heard words that changed everything. Stage 2, prostate cancer. PSA, level 47. Treatment recommended immediately. Estimated cost $78,500. I'd walked out of that office with the paperwork folded in my jacket pocket, and I'd never told Kathy. How could I? She was already rationing insulin to stay alive. How was I supposed to tell her I needed $78,000 for treatment that might not even work? So I'd hidden the diagnosis, buried the papers in my truck's glove box. And 7 days later, I'd carried my wife into an emergency room with ketoacidosis ravaging her system. The ICU nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, had gotten Kathy stabilized within a few hours. Dr. Sarah Morrison, the endocrinologist on call, had explained it all in careful terms. Diabetic ketoacidosis, potassium, imbalance, severe dehydration. They'd started an IV drip, adjusted her levels, monitored her heart. "She'll be okay," Dr. Morrison had told me in the hallway. "But Mr. Sullivan, this can't happen again. The insulin, she needs it. Full doses, every day." "I know," I'd said. "If she keeps rationing next time, we might not be able to bring her back." I'd nodded, unable to speak. The bill came 2 days later, $12,847. I'd sat in the hospital cafeteria at 2 in the morning, staring at that number, trying to figure out how we'd ever pay it. My pension was $32,000 a year. We were already behind on everything. That's when I'd called Jason, 13 times. 13 calls over the course of 3 hours. He didn't answer once. I'd found out later, much later after Kathy was discharged, where he'd been that day. Sanctuary Camelback Mountain, an $850 couples massage. Him and Amber relaxing in a luxury spa, while his mother lay in an ICU bed 30 miles away. But what I'll never forget, what burned itself into my memory like a brand, happened on the second day of Kathy's hospital stay. I'd stepped out of her room to use the restroom. She was sleeping finally, the machines beeping softly beside her bed. The hallway was quiet, just me and the fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant. That's when I heard voices around the corner. Jason's voice, low, but not quite low enough. "I'm just saying it's $50,000. The policy's been paid up for years." And then Amber's voice, sharper, colder. "How much longer do you think she has?" Honestly, I'd frozen, pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing. "I don't know," Jason had said. "A year, maybe less. The doctor said her kidneys are—" "So we wait," Amber had interrupted. "We wait, and then we deal with the house, the policy, all of it. It's not ideal, but it's not like we have a choice. Your father's got nothing." "Yeah, just that. Yeah, not an argument, not a defense of his mother, just agreement. I'd stood there in that hallway listening to my son and his wife discuss my wife's life insurance policy, like it was a stock they were waiting to mature, and something inside me had broken. Not shattered, broken, cleanly. The way a bone breaks when too much weight's been put on it for too long. I'd waited until they left, walked back into Kathy's room, sat beside her bed, and held her hand while she slept. And 2 days later, March 12th, I'd signed up to drive for a rideshare service. Night shifts 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning. 71 years old with an undiagnosed cancer eating away at me, driving strangers around Scottsdale for $20 an hour. It was all I could think to do. Now sitting in Mastro's with the memory of that hallway conversation echoing in my head, I looked across the table at my son. He was scrolling through his phone again, not even pretending to pay attention to his mother anymore. Kathy was asking Amber something about baby names. Her voice was soft, hopeful trembling, with the same joy I'd heard when Jason was born 46 years ago. Amber answered without looking up from her wine glass, and I thought about $50,000, about an $850 massage, about 13 unanswered calls. I thought about the $600 currently sitting in Miguel's pocket, our rent money gone, because I knew what was coming, and I'd be damned if I let them humiliate her. My hands were steady on the table. I kept them that way deliberately, forced myself to breathe evenly, to stay calm. But inside I was burning. 8 weeks ago, I'd heard my son agree that we should just wait for his mother to pass. Wait for the insurance money, wait like vultures. Tonight I was going to show him exactly what that waiting had cost. But that wasn't the only time I'd seen that look in Amber's eyes, the one that said Kathy didn't matter. 2 weeks before tonight, April 28th, a Sunday afternoon, I'd been sitting in our living room that morning, drinking coffee and trying not to think about the eviction notice tucked in the kitchen drawer when my phone buzzed. A message from my neighbor Helen. "Did you see what your daughter-in-law posted?" I didn't have social media, never saw the point, but Helen had sent me a screenshot. There was Amber smiling at the camera, her wrist extended to show off a diamond bracelet that caught the light like a small constellation. The caption read, "Treated myself, Tiffany & Co. Because I deserve it. Hashtag self-love, hashtag luxury lifestyle." Below the image, 847,000 people had seen it, liked it, commented things like, "Stunning" and "You go girl." Helen's next message, Tiffany website, says that bracelet is $8,500. I'd stared at that number for a long time. $8,500, more than half of what we owed in medical bills, more than 6 months of Kathy's insulin, enough to keep us from being evicted. And Amber had bought it for herself, because she deserved it. I'd showed Kathy the screenshot. She'd looked at it quietly, then handed my phone back without a word. "It's her money," she'd said softly. "She can spend it how she wants." That afternoon, Jason and Amber had shown up at our house unannounced. Jason had a Mother's Day card in his hand, one of those expensive ones from the fancy stationery store, thick paper with embossed flowers on the front. "We wanted to give this to you early, Mom," he'd said, handing it to Kathy, "since we'll see you on the actual day anyway." Kathy had smiled, touched. "You didn't have to do that." "Of course we did," Amber had said, adjusting the bracelet on her wrist, the same one from the photo. It glinted in the afternoon light streaming through our living room window. Kathy had opened the envelope carefully the way she always did, trying not to tear the paper. She'd pulled out the card, beautiful probably $7 or $8 just for the card itself, and opened it. Inside was nothing. Not a signature, not a message, not even a scribbled "Love Jason and Amber," just blank white space. Kathy had stared at it for a long moment, her smile frozen on her face. I'd watched the light go out of her eyes. "Oh," she'd said quietly. Amber had laughed a light, careless sound. "We thought at your age simple is best. You know, less clutter. We figured you'd appreciate the sentiment more than a bunch of words you'd just forget anyway." Kathy's hands had started to tremble. She'd closed the card, carefully set it on the coffee table. That's very thoughtful," she'd managed. "Glad you like it," Amber had said, already checking her phone. Jason had glanced at his mother, then at his wife, then back at the TV playing silently in the corner. He'd said nothing. Kathy had stood up slowly. "Excuse me, I need to use the restroom." She'd walked out of the room with her shoulders very straight, her head up, but I'd heard it the way her breath caught, the way her footsteps quickened as she reached the hallway. And then through the closed bathroom door, I'd heard her cry. Not loud, not theatrical, just small broken sounds that she was trying to muffle with a towel or her hands or whatever she could find. I'd sat there on the couch, the blank card on the table, between me and my son, listening to my wife's heartbreak in the next room. "So, Dad," Jason had said, scrolling through his phone, "how's the car running?" And now, 2 weeks later, I sat across from that same son in a restaurant that cost more than our monthly grocery budget, watching him ignore his mother all over again. The waiter had returned with our entrees. He set them down one by one with practiced precision. Amber's lobster tail, a massive thing, butterflied and glistening with butter, served with asparagus and roasted potatoes. $95. Jason's steaks, Wagyu ribeye, seared perfectly, the kind of meat that practically melted. $185. Kathy's soup, the French onion she'd ordered at the start, now cold, the cheese congealed on top. $18. She hadn't touched it. My Salad House Greens simple dressing, $16. "Enjoy your meals," the waiter said, and disappeared. Amber cut into her lobster, immediately not bothering to wait for anyone else. Jason sawed into his steak, the knife making a soft sound against the plate. I looked at Kathy. She was staring at her soup, her hands folded in her lap. I could see them trembling even from across the table. And then I saw it, the dark stain spreading across her left stocking just above the ankle, the ulcer. It had started bleeding again, seeping through the bandage she'd wrapped that morning, soaking into the fabric. She noticed me looking and shifted in her seat, trying to tuck her foot under her chair where no one could see. "You okay, Mom?" Jason asked, glancing up briefly from his phone. "Oh yes, fine," Kathy said quickly. He nodded and went back to his screen. Amber was describing something, her voice bright and animated, talking about a trip they were planning. Greece, Santorini specifically. The white buildings and blue water, and some resort that cost $4,000 a night. "We're thinking September," she said, dipping lobster into butter. "Before it gets too cold. Jason's never been, and I just think it'll be so romantic, you know. Plus we'll need a vacation before the baby comes." She touched her stomach, flat, no sign of the pregnancy she'd claimed. 14 weeks, she'd said. But there was nothing there. Not yet anyway. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was too early to show. But I didn't think so. Kathy tried to smile. "That sounds lovely. Have you ever been to Greece, Catherine?" Amber asked, not really looking at her, more interested in the lobster. "No, we never traveled much." "Oh, that's too bad." Amber didn't sound like she thought it was bad. She sounded like she'd expected that answer. "Well, I'll send you pictures." "That would be nice." Kathy's voice was so small, so tired. I reached under the table and found her hand again. It was ice cold, shaking badly now. I squeezed gently. She squeezed back barely. Amber kept talking about Mykonos and Athens and some restaurant she'd read about that had Michelin stars. About the infinity pool at the resort and the private beach and the spa treatments included with the room. $4,000 a night for a hotel room. We were 2 months behind on rent, $12,000 behind on medical bills. My wife was bleeding through her stocking at a dinner table, and my son's wife was describing a vacation that cost more than we'd made all year. Jason said nothing. Just ate his $185 steak and scrolled through his phone. Kathy's soup remained untouched, the cheese now completely solid. I ate my salad slowly, mechanically, each bite tasting like dust. And Amber talked, on and on and on, her voice filling the space where conversation should have been. Where questions about Kathy's health, or compliments about her dress, or even just basic acknowledgement of her existence might have gone. But there was none of that. Just Greece. Just infinity pools and Michelin stars and $4,000 rooms. I looked at my son. At the expensive watch on his wrist, $20,000 easy. At the tailored suit. At the phone that was probably his 3rd or 4th upgrade this year. And I thought about the blank card sitting on our coffee table at home. The one with no words inside. The one that had made my wife cry in our bathroom while her son sat in the living room and asked about my car. Simple is best, Amber had said, at your age. Like Kathy was already gone, already forgotten, already just an obstacle between them and $50,000. I set down my fork and looked across the table. Jason felt my gaze and glanced up from his phone. "What? Nothing," I said quietly. But it wasn't nothing. And he was about to find out exactly what it was. My attention drifted, old habit from the fire station, always scanning the room, always looking for exits, for hazards, for the things other people missed. That's when I noticed the woman at table 12. She sat alone, which was unusual for a place like this on Mother's Day. Mid to late 40s, I guessed, dark hair pulled back. She wore scrubs the kind nurses or medical staff wear, like she'd come straight from a shift. Her meal sat mostly untouched in front of her, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was her phone. She held it casually propped against her water glass, at an angle, To anyone else, it would look like she was scrolling through messages or checking the time. But I'd spent 30 years reading situations, and I knew what I was seeing. She was recording. The lens was pointed directly at our table. Not obviously she was good at it subtle, but I could see the red dot reflected in the screen's black border. She'd been capturing everything. How long I wasn't sure, but long enough. I should have felt something alarm maybe, or anger. But I felt nothing except a strange sense of inevitability. Like somewhere deep down, I'd known this moment was coming. That whatever was about to happen needed witnesses. I looked away before she noticed me watching. That's when Miguel appeared at our table. "How is everything this evening?" He asked, his voice warm and professional. He addressed the question to all of us, but his eyes stayed on me. "Excellent," Amber said, not looking up from her lobster. "The food here is amazing." "I'm glad to hear it." Miguel nodded, then turned to Kathy. "And you, ma'am, is the soup to your liking?" Kathy forced a smile. "It's very good, thank you." Miguel's gaze shifted to me, and I saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or curiosity. His eyes dropped to my hands resting on the table beside my barely touched salad. He stared at my right hand for a beat too long. I knew what he was seeing. The scar, a silvered line of puckered skin that ran from my knuckles up to my wrist. An old burn 30 years healed, but still visible. I'd gotten it in 1994, pulling a man out of a warehouse fire on East Van Buren. The beam had fallen, pinned him. I'd grabbed it with my bare hand to shift it, and the heat had seared through my glove like it was paper. The man had lived, my hand had healed, the scar stayed. Most people didn't notice it, or if they did, they didn't ask. But Miguel noticed. He looked at it then, at me, then back at the scar. Something passed across his face, something I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe? Or recognition. "If you need anything," he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine, "anything at all, please let me know." There was weight in those words, more than just a manager checking on customers. "And thank you," I said. He nodded, once lingered for another second, then moved on to the next table. I watched him go, wondering what he'd seen in that scar, what he remembered. But before I could think too much about it, Jason's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and his face tightened. "I need to take this," he muttered, pushing back his chair. "Who is it?" Amber asked, finally looking up from her plate. "Derek, work stuff. On Mother's Day. It's important." Jason was already standing, phone pressed to his ear. "Yeah, I'm here. Hang on." He walked away from the table, weaving through the restaurant toward the entrance. I watched him go, saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand clenched into a fist at his side. Derek, his business partner. The guy he'd started the real estate company with back in 2009, right after I'd given him the money. I'd met Derek once, slicked too many teeth, when he smiled, the kind of guy who called everyone buddy and made you feel like you needed to count your fingers after shaking his hand. Something was wrong. I could tell by the way Jason had moved, the urgency in his voice. But Amber didn't seem concerned. She just shrugged and went back to her lobster, pouring herself another glass of wine from the bottle that had cost more than our electric bill. The Camus. $142. She'd already finished half of it. Pregnant, she'd said. 14 weeks. I looked at the wine glass in her hand and said nothing. Across from me, Kathy lifted her spoon and tried the soup again. She managed one spoonful, then another. But I could see the effort it took, the way she had to force herself to swallow, the way her throat worked against the texture. The ulcer on her foot was still bleeding. I could see the stain spreading slowly across her stocking. And her stomach. God, her stomach had to be a mess too. The rationed insulin, the irregular meals, months of her body trying to survive on half of what it needed. She set the spoon down after the third bite and folded her hands in her lap. "Not hungry?" I asked quietly. "And just full," she lied. I reached over and squeezed her hand. It was trembling again. I looked around the restaurant, at the other tables, at the families celebrating. There was a couple, 2 tables over maybe our age, holding hands across the tablecloth. The woman was laughing at something her husband said, her face bright with joy. 3 tables to the left, a family with kids, teenagers, probably were passing around a phone, looking at photos, all of them smiling. Mother's Day, a celebration. Everywhere I looked, people were together, happy, present. And then there was us. Kathy with her untouched soup and bleeding foot, trying to smile through the pain. Amber with her lobster and her wine, and her phone utterly oblivious. Jason somewhere near the entrance, pacing, while he talked about business problems he wouldn't explain. And me, sitting at a table I'd paid for with rent money, watching my wife suffer, knowing I couldn't fix it. Couldn't make it better. Couldn't do anything except sit here and hold her hand and wait for the moment when everything would finally come to a head. I'd never felt more alone in my life. Not when I'd carried bodies out of burning buildings. Not when I'd sat in a hospital waiting room while Kathy fought ketoacidosis. Not even when I'd heard my son talk about waiting for his mother to pass so he could collect insurance money. This was worse. Because I was surrounded by people who were supposed to love us, and none of them saw us at all. The woman at table 12 was still recording. I could see her in my peripheral vision, phone angled just right, capturing everything. Good, I thought distantly. Let her record it. Let someone see what this looks like. Jason returned to the table 10 minutes later. His face was tight pale under the restaurant's golden lighting. He sat down without a word, picked up his knife and fork, and went back to cutting his steak. Everything okay? Kathy asked softly. Fine, Jason said, not looking at her. Are you sure you look... I said it's fine, Mom. His tone was sharp, dismissive. Kathy flinched slightly and went quiet. Amber glanced at him, then at her phone, then back at her food. Derek's such a drama queen, she muttered, always calling about something. Jason didn't respond, just kept cutting his steak, the knife making small, precise sounds against the plate. I watched him, watched the way his jaw was clenched, the way his eyes stayed fixed on his food, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Something was very wrong with the business. I could feel it, but he wasn't going to tell us. He never told us anything anymore. I set down my fork and folded my hands on the table, my scarred right hand resting on top of my left. Across the room, Miguel was watching from near the bar. The woman at table 12 was still recording. And at our table, we sat in silence, 4 people eating a meal that no one wanted, pretending we were a family. The check was coming soon. And when it did, everything would change. The waiter returned to clear our plates. Kathy's soup bowl was still nearly full, the congealed cheese untouched. My salad was half eaten. Amber's lobster plate was scraped clean, as was Jason's steak. Can I interest anyone in dessert this evening? The waiter asked politely. Amber didn't hesitate. I'll have the creme brulee. Excellent choice. And for you, sir. Jason glanced up from his phone. Chocolate lava cake. The waiter turned to Kathy. Ma'am. Oh, no, thank you, Kathy said softly. I'm quite full. And you, sir? Nothing for me, I said. The waiter nodded and left. $24 for Amber's dessert, $22 for Jason's, $46 for sugar and cream, while my wife sat there with her hands folded, having eaten maybe 3 spoonfuls of $18 soup. Kathy shifted in her seat and I saw her wince. The ulcer. It had to be worse now. We'd been sitting here for over 2 hours and the stain on her stocking had darkened, spreading wider. But she said nothing. Just reached for her purse and pulled out her phone. That's Jason, honey, she said, her voice tentative, hopeful. I wanted to show you something. Jason's eyes stayed on his own screen, his thumb scrolling. I found some old photos of you when you were little. Kathy's hands trembled slightly as she opened her photo app. I thought, with the baby coming, you might want to see them, remember. She held the phone out toward him, tilting the screen so he could see. I could make out the image from where I sat. Jason may be 3 or 4 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a toy fire truck I'd bought him for his birthday. That's you with the truck your father got you, Kathy said, smiling at the memory. You carried that thing everywhere for a year, wouldn't let it out of your sight. Uh-huh, Jason said, not looking up. And this one, Kathy swiped to the next photo. This was your first day of kindergarten. Remember, you were so nervous, but you were so brave. Mom, I'm kind of in the middle of something, Jason interrupted, still scrolling. Kathy's smile faltered. Oh, I just thought, with the baby you might want to, maybe later, okay. He didn't look at her, didn't even glance at the phone she was holding out like an offering, just kept scrolling through whatever was on his screen posts, probably from people he'd never met, pictures of things that didn't matter. Kathy lowered the phone slowly. Of course, later. She closed the app and set the phone face down on the table. Her hands went back to her lap, folding together the way they always did when she was trying not to cry. I watched Jason, watched the way he sat there completely oblivious to what he'd just done. The way his mother had tried to share a piece of his childhood with him, tried to connect him to the life growing inside his wife, to remind him that he'd been that small, once that vulnerable, that loved, and he'd dismissed her without even looking. And suddenly, I was back in a different hospital, a different crisis, 40 years ago. May 1984, I'd come home from my night shift at the station at 6 in the morning, 24 hours of back-to-back calls, a kitchen fire, a car wreck on the I-17. an apartment building where the smoke detectors had been disabled, and 3 people nearly didn't make it out. I was exhausted, covered in soot, ready to fall into bed. But when I walked in the door, Kathy met me in the hallway, her face pale. "It's Jason," she'd said. "He's burning up." I'd found him in his bedroom, 6 years old, small for his age, curled up under his Star Wars sheets. His face was flushed red, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. When I touched his skin, it was like touching a radiator. The thermometer read 104. How long? I'd asked Kathy. "Since midnight. I gave him medicine, but it's not going down." I'd scooped him up, he'd weighed maybe 40 pounds light as air, and carried him to the car. Kathy had grabbed a bag, and we'd driven to the same hospital where she'd be treated decades later for ketoacidosis. Pneumonia, the doctor had said. Severe. They'd admitted him, immediately started antibiotics, kept him for 3 days. The bill came to $847. In 1984, that was a fortune. I was making maybe $22,000 a year at the station. We had a mortgage, a car payment, groceries, utilities. $847 might as well have been $8,000. I'd had a truck back then, a '78 Ford F-150, nothing fancy, but it ran. I'd bought it used for $3,000 a few years earlier, and it was mine. Paid off, no payments. I sold it to a guy at the station for $1,500. Took the loss because I needed the cash immediately. Then I picked up every extra shift I could. Worked 50, 60 hours a week for 3 months straight until we'd caught back up. But the night they'd admitted Jason, that first night, when we didn't know if the antibiotics would work, if his fever would break, if he'd be okay, I'd sat in a chair beside his hospital bed and held his small, hot hand in mine. He'd been unconscious, delirious with fever, but I'd held on anyway. And I'd made him a promise. "I'll always take care of you," I'd whispered. "No matter what. You're my son, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Always." He hadn't heard me, but I'd meant it. Now, 40 years later, I sat across from that same boy, a man now 46 years old, wearing a suit that cost more than that hospital bill, and watched him scroll through his phone while his mother tried to show him pictures of the child he used to be. The child I'd sold my truck for. The child I'd worked 60-hour weeks for. The child whose hand I'd held in a hospital room while promising him the world. He couldn't even look at her. The desserts arrived. The waiter set them down with a flourish, Amber's creme brulee in a perfect ceramic dish, the sugar on top caramelized to a golden shell. Jason's chocolate lava cake, molten center, oozing out when he cut into it with his fork. Amber took a bite and made a small sound of satisfaction. "Oh my God, this is amazing." Jason nodded, already halfway through his own. "Yeah, it's good." Neither of them looked at Kathy. Neither of them noticed that she hadn't ordered anything, that she'd barely eaten all night, that the stain on her stocking had spread to the size of a silver dollar, now dark and wet. I reached under the table and found her hand again. It was ice cold despite the warmth of the restaurant. She squeezed back weakly. Across from us, Jason set down his fork and picked up his phone again, started scrolling. The cake sat half-finished on his plate. Amber finished her creme brulee and pushed the empty dish aside. She dabbed her mouth with her napkin, checked her own phone, then looked up at the ceiling like she was bored. The waiter appeared again. "Is there anything else I can get for you this evening?" Amber waved a hand dismissively. "No, we're good. Just the check, please." "Of course. I'll be right back." The waiter disappeared, and just like that it was here. The moment I had been waiting for. The moment I had paid $600 to orchestrate. The moment when everything I'd been holding inside for months, years, maybe would finally come out into the open. Amber leaned back in her chair, satisfied, full ready to leave. Jason set his phone down and reached for his wallet, a reflex, the casual gesture of someone who'd never had to worry about whether there was enough inside to cover the bill. Kathy's hand trembled in mine. And I thought about that promise I'd made in 1984, about the truck I'd sold, about the shifts I'd worked, about every sacrifice I'd made because I loved my son and wanted him to have a good life. I'd given him everything. And he couldn't even look at his mother when she tried to show him a photograph. The waiter was coming back now. I could see him across the restaurant, a black folder in his hand. The check. I let go of Kathy's hand and straightened in my seat. 40 years ago, I'd promised to protect my son. Tonight I was going to protect my wife. From him. If you're still here with me at this moment, comment "still here," so I know you're continuing this journey with the story. And I want to ask you something. If you were sitting at that table and heard a son and his wife say they wouldn't pay for his own mother, what would you do when the bill finally arrived? Share your thoughts in the comments. And before the story continues, a quick note: some parts ahead include Dramatized elements added for storytelling. If this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to stop the video here. The waiter returned with a black leather folder in his hand. He approached our table carefully, the way you'd approach something fragile, and set it down in the center, equidistant from all of us, neutral territory. "Whenever you're ready," he said quietly, then stepped back. For a moment, no one moved. The folder sat there on the white tablecloth, like a small black stone. I could see the edge of the receipt peeking out white paper with neat rows of numbers. Amber reached for it first. Of course she did. She flipped it open and her eyes scanned down the page. I watched her face as she calculated, lips moving slightly, a small frown forming between her perfectly shaped eyebrows. Appetizers $131, entrees $314, desserts $46, wine $142, tax and gratuity $54.42, total $687.42. I already knew the number. Had known it since 3 o'clock this afternoon when I'd handed Miguel $600 in cash and told him to cover whatever came next. Amber set the folder down and looked up at our waiter, the same young man who'd been serving us all night. His name tag read Tyler. He was maybe 25, clean cut, the kind of kid who was probably working his way through college or saving up for something. He had no idea what was about to happen. "Tyler," Amber said, her voice bright and clear, carrying across the table. "We're going to need separate checks." The waiter blinked. "Separate checks?" "Yes." Amber gestured at the receipt. "2 checks, one for us." She indicated herself and Jason, and one for them. She pointed across the table. At Kathy, at my wife, who sat there with her hands folded, her face pale, her stocking stained dark from the ulcer that wouldn't stop bleeding. Tyler looked confused. I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm not sure I understand. You'd like to split the check evenly or—" No, Amber interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "We'll pay for our meals. They can pay for theirs." She paused, then added with a small laugh. "Don't worry, we're not paying for her." She said it loud enough that the tables around us could hear. The word hung in the air like smoke. Her. Not them. Not my in-laws. Not Hank and Catherine. Her. Like Kathy was an object, a burden, something other. Tyler's face went red. "Ma'am, I don't think—" But Jason cut him off. "That's fine," my son said. His voice was calm, matter of fact, like he was confirming a dinner reservation or agreeing to a wine selection. "Separate checks, that works." And then, God help me, he nodded, a single clear nod of agreement. He'd heard what his wife said, heard her dismiss his mother, heard her say they wouldn't pay for her, heard the cruelty in her voice. And he'd agreed. I watched Kathy's face, watched the exact moment the words registered, watched her eyes go wide, then glassy, watched her lips part slightly like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. A tear slid down her cheek. Then another. She didn't wipe them away, didn't make a sound, just sat there frozen while tears fell silently onto the white tablecloth, leaving small dark spots on the fabric. I did nothing. I picked up my water glass and took a sip. Set it down carefully. My hand was steady. My face was calm. Inside I was burning, but I'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous fires are the ones that burn cold. Tyler stood there stammering. Sir, ma'am, I really don't think we can— the check is already totaled and I'd have to ask my manager." "That's fine," Amber said breezily. "Go ask your manager. We'll wait." She leaned back in her chair, satisfied, like she'd just solved a problem, like she'd done something reasonable. Around us, the restaurant had gone quiet. Not completely. There was still the murmur of conversation from distant tables, the soft clink of silverware, the low background music, but our immediate area had fallen into a hush. People were staring. I could see them in my peripheral vision. The couple 2 tables over had stopped eating their forks suspended halfway to their mouths. The family with teenagers had all turned to look. The woman at table 12, Rachel, though I didn't know her name yet, had her phone angled directly at us. And she wasn't the only one. Phones were coming out all around us. Slowly, subtly, people raising devices and angling screens. 20 of them, maybe more. Little glowing rectangles capturing everything. The moment had witnesses. Amber didn't notice. Or if she did, she didn't care. She picked up her wine glass, still a finger left in the bottom, and took a sip. "Honestly," she said, setting the glass down. She wasn't even looking at Kathy anymore, just talking like she was explaining something obvious to Tyler. "They're on a fixed income. They understand, right? She glanced at me expecting agreement, expecting me to nod and smile and confirm that, yes, we understood we were poor and old, and it made perfect sense that we should pay our own way. I said nothing, just looked at her. My face was stone. Amber's smile faltered slightly. She looked at Jason, who had already gone back to his phone, scrolling through something disconnected. Kathy's shoulders shook, just once, a small tremor that she tried to suppress. I reached under the table and found her hand. It was ice-cold, trembling badly. I wrapped my fingers around hers and squeezed gently. She squeezed back, barely any strength left in her grip. And then I reached into my jacket with my other hand, the folder I'd been carrying since 3 o'clock this afternoon, the one I'd kept close all through dinner, pressed against my ribs like a secret, like ammunition. I pulled it out slowly and set it on the table. It was old, the kind with a fraying elastic band wrapped around it to keep it closed. The cardboard was soft at the edges, worn from being handled. Inside were papers, documents, evidence. 40 years worth of truth. Tyler was still standing there, his face bright red, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Amber was watching me now, her expression shifting from smug satisfaction to confusion. "What's that?" she asked. I didn't answer. The restaurant around us had gone even quieter. More phones were up now, 30 maybe, 40. A sea of glowing screens all pointed at our table. Jason glanced up from his phone, finally noticing something was happening. "Dad," I looked at my son, at the man I'd raised, the boy I'd held in a hospital bed 40 years ago, promising I'd always protect him. The man who just nodded in agreement when his wife said they wouldn't pay for his mother. I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped against the floor, a harsh sound in the silence, and I stood up, slowly, deliberately. I kept one hand on the folder, kept the other hand resting on the edge of the table, and I looked at my son. Every eye in the restaurant was on me now. Every conversation had stopped. Even the background music seemed quieter. Kathy was still crying silently, her hand pressed to her mouth. Amber's smile had disappeared entirely. She looked uncertain now, almost nervous. Jason set his phone down. "Dad, what are you—" $687.42, I said quietly. My voice wasn't loud. I didn't shout, didn't raise it at all. But in that silence it carried. "That's what this meal cost," I continued. "That's what you were about to ask your mother to pay for. $18 for soup she couldn't eat, while you ordered a $185 steak." Jason opened his mouth, closed it. Amber started to say something, but I held up one hand. "I'm not finished," I said. And then I opened the folder. I placed my hand on the folder, ready to pull out the first document when Miguel appeared beside our table. He moved quickly but not urgently, the smooth efficiency of someone who'd managed a restaurant for years and knew exactly when to intervene. His presence commanded attention. Conversations at nearby tables fell silent. Even Tyler the waiter stepped back, slightly relief flickering across his young face. Miguel looked at Tyler first, his voice calm and clear. "There's no check," he said. Tyler blinked. "Sir, there's no check to split," Miguel repeated louder now, so the surrounding tables could hear. "The bill has already been paid." Amber's head snapped up. "What?" Jason set his phone down, confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean it's already been paid?" Miguel turned to me, and I saw the question in his eyes, the silent asking of permission to continue. I gave him a small nod. "Mr. Sullivan," Miguel said, addressing me formally but with warmth, "paid for this entire meal earlier this afternoon, at 3 o'clock, in cash." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Amber stared at Miguel like he'd just spoken a foreign language. That doesn't make sense. Why would— $600, I said quietly, cutting her off. All eyes shifted to me. I kept my hand on the folder, but didn't open it yet. Just stood there, looking at my son and his wife. I gave Miguel $600 in cash at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I continued. My voice was steady, calm. The same tone I'd used for 30 years, talking people through fires, through panic, through crisis. That was our rent money for May. We're already 2 months behind. Our landlord started sending eviction notices last week. Kathy made a small sound, a choked gasp that she tried to muffle with her hand. I squeezed her shoulder gently with my free hand, then looked back at Jason. "I took our rent money," I said, "and I paid for this dinner in advance. Because I knew—" I paused, let the words hang there for a beat. "I knew you would do exactly what you just did." The silence in that section of the restaurant was absolute. Phones were still raised, still recording, but the people holding them had gone completely still. The couple 2 tables over the ones who'd been holding hands earlier were staring at us with their mouths open, The family with teenagers had all set down their forks. The woman at table 12 had her phone steady as stone, capturing every word. Jason's face had gone pale. Not just pale gray like all the blood had drained out of him. "Dad," he started, his voice hoarse. I didn't know you were going to what?" I asked. "Pay for my own wife's dinner, pay so she wouldn't be humiliated." I shook my head. "No, son, you didn't know, because you didn't ask. You didn't wonder. You just assumed we'd, figure it out." Amber found her voice then. "This is ridiculous," she said, but there was a tremor in it now, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. "You didn't have to do that. We would have what?" I interrupted. "Paid for her?" I looked directly at Amber. "You just told the waiter in front of this entire restaurant that you wouldn't pay for her." I gestured to Kathy. "You said it, loud enough for everyone to hear, and he—" I pointed at Jason, nodded. He agreed. Jason flinched like I'd slapped him. Around us I could hear whispers starting, murmurs of shock and sympathy. "Oh my God," someone said. "That's his mother," another voice whispered. "He used his rent money," a woman said, her voice breaking slightly. "His rent money." Miguel stood quietly to the side, his hands clasped in front of him, his face carefully neutral. But I could see the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw was set. He was angry on our behalf, but he was too professional to show it. Tyler, the waiter, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Amber's face had flushed red now, whether from shame or anger I couldn't tell. Probably both. "You're making a scene," she hissed. "Everyone is staring." "Good," I said simply. "Let them stare. Let them see." I moved my hand back to the folder, flipping it open fully now. Inside were papers, documents I'd carefully organized over the past week, ever since I'd heard Jason and Amber talking in that hospital hallway 8 weeks ago. "I paid for dinner," I said, looking at Jason, "so your mother wouldn't have to sit here and be told she wasn't worth $18 worth of soup. But that's not why we're here. That's not what this is about." I pulled out the first document carefully, slowly, so everyone could see I was handling something important. "This," I said, holding it up, "is about where $2 million went." Jason's eyes went wide. Amber's mouth fell open. And the crowd, the witnesses, the recording phones, the 50-plus people who'd now stopped eating entirely to watch our table leaned in closer. I held the paper at an angle so Jason could see it, so the people at the nearest tables could see it, so the cameras could capture it. It was a bank statement, old but preserved in a plastic sleeve. The date at the top read March 15th, 2008, and the transaction line was highlighted in yellow. Transfer to Jason Michael Sullivan. Amount $2 million. "Do you remember this?" I asked quietly. Jason stared at the document. His hands had started to shake. "Dad, do you remember?" I repeated, my voice harder now. "The day I sat you down in our kitchen and gave you everything, every cent your grandparents left me when they died? $2 million. You were 30 years old. You said—" My voice caught slightly, but I pushed through. "You said you'd make me proud." Kathy was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking. Jason's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. Amber reached for the document like she wanted to snatch it away, but I pulled it back. "I'm not done," I said. Miguel had moved closer, positioning himself between Amber and me, subtly protective, ready to intervene if she tried anything. His eyes met mine briefly, and I saw something there. Recognition. Understanding. I set the bank statement down on the table, where everyone could see it. Then I reached back into the folder. "That was 16 years ago," I said. $2 million. Your mother and I gave you everything. We kept nothing. We trusted you." I pulled out the next document. And this, I said, my voice dropping to almost a whisper, but in that silence everyone heard it, "is what we've been paying ever since." The paper I held now was a hospital bill. March 10th, 2024. Patient Catherine Sullivan, diabetic ketoacidosis. Amount due, $12,847. Status unpaid. I laid it on the table next to the bank statement. The crowd had gone from silent to stunned. I could hear sharp intakes of breath. A woman at a nearby table had her hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes. Jason was staring at the two documents like they were written in a language he couldn't understand. And I wasn't finished. Not even close. I reached back into the folder and pulled out the rest. Not one document, not two. A stack. Hospital bills, doctor's invoices, pharmacy receipts, insurance denial letters, collection notices. 3 years worth of paper held together with a binder clip, the edges worn soft from being handled too many times. I set the stack on the table beside the two documents already there, the $2 million transfer and the $12,000 hospital bill, and the contrast was impossible to miss. One piece of paper showing everything we'd given, dozens of others showing everything it had cost us since. Amber found her voice first. "That was 16 years ago," she said, gesturing at the bank statement. Her tone was defensive, almost angry. I can't expect what?" I interrupted, my voice cutting through hers. "I can't expect my son to remember that his parents gave him $2 million, that we kept nothing for ourselves, that we trusted him." Amber's mouth snapped shut. I picked up the stack of medical bills and held them up so everyone could see. "And this," I said, "is what your mother and I have been paying since we gave you everything." I set the stack down and began pulling out individual sheets, laying them across the table one by one, like I was dealing cards. Each one had a number highlighted in yellow. Each one represented a piece of our lives we'd traded for survival. "Insulin," I said, holding up the first receipt. "Your mother has type 2 diabetes. She needs insulin to live. Without insurance, it costs $750 a month. Over the past 3 years, that's $27,000. I set it down and picked up the next one. Emergency room visits, $10,000. 3 trips in 2 years because her glucose levels went so high, she nearly didn't make it. Another paper. Hospital stays, $70,000. That includes the ICU stay from March when she went into ketoacidosis because, my voice hardened, because she'd been rationing her insulin for months, cutting her doses in half to make them last longer. Kathy made a sound, a choked sob that she tried to muffle with her napkin. Her shoulders shook. I kept going. Wound care, $7,200, for the ulcer on her foot that won't heal because her circulation is damaged, and we can't afford the specialist visits she needs. Next paper, medications, $7,200. Blood pressure pills, cholesterol medication, pain management, none of it covered. Next, medical equipment, $18,000. Glucose monitors, testing strips, bandages, compression socks, walkers. Everything insurance denied. Last one, doctor visits, $6,900. Endocrinologist, podiatrist, primary care. Cash payment only because we lost our insurance when I couldn't afford the premiums anymore. I set down the final receipt and looked at Jason. "Do you want to know what all of that adds up to?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer, couldn't answer, just stared at the table covered in papers. $146,300, I said. Each word fell like a stone into still water. "That's what we've paid in the last 3 years alone. While your mother cut her insulin doses in half, while her foot started rotting because we couldn't afford proper treatment, while I drove strangers around at night for $20 an hour because my pension couldn't cover it." The restaurant was silent except for the sound of Kathy crying. I picked up one of the insulin receipts, the most recent one from last month. "This is from April," I said. $750. We didn't have it, so she took half her normal dose. And then half again, and by March 10th, her body was eating itself from the inside out. I held up the hospital bill from that day, the $12,000 one. "This is what happened when she finally collapsed. Diabetic ketoacidosis. Her glucose was 450. The doctor told me," my voice cracked slightly, "told me that if I'd waited another hour to bring her in, she might not have made it." Someone in the crowd, a woman at a nearby table, let out a sob. I looked at Jason, really looked at him, at my son who sat there with his expensive suit and his $1,000 watch, staring at the evidence of his mother's suffering like it was happening to a stranger. "Her foot is rotting," I said, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Right now, under the table, that stain you see on her stocking, that's not water. That's from the ulcer that's been bleeding all night because we couldn't afford the supplies to dress it properly this week." Kathy covered her face with both hands, her whole body shaking with sobs now. I stepped around the table and put my hand on her shoulder, squeezed gently. "It's okay," I whispered to her. "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. None of this was okay. I turned back to Jason. Around us, the restaurant had transformed into something else entirely. This wasn't dinner anymore. This was a reckoning. And every person in that room, 50, 60 people, maybe more, was a witness to it. I could see tears on faces. A man at the table behind Jason had his head in his hands. The woman who'd sobbed earlier was crying openly, her husband's arm around her shoulders. Even some of the waitstaff had stopped what they were doing to watch, their eyes red. The phones were still recording, all of them, capturing every word, every number, every tear. Jason's face had gone beyond pale, now it was gray ashen. His hands shook where they rested on the table. He opened his mouth several times, but no sound came out. Finally, he managed, "Dad, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was this bad." I looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't know," I repeated slowly, "because you never asked." Those 5 words hung in the air like an indictment. Not once. I continued, my voice quiet, but carrying in that absolute silence. "In 3 years did you ask how we were doing? Not once did you ask if we needed help. You came to our house twice in 3 years. Twice. And both times you stayed less than an hour." Jason's mouth worked silently. "You called on our birthdays," I said, "left messages, sent cards, but you never asked." I gestured at the papers spread across the table. "We were drowning, and you never even noticed we were underwater." Jason's voice broke. "I thought you were fine. You never said..." "We never said..." I felt something crack open inside me, something that had been pressed down for years. "How are we supposed to tell you when you wouldn't answer our calls, when you were too busy to visit, when the only time we saw you was at holidays? And even then, you spent the whole time on your phone." Tears were streaming down Jason's face now. Real tears. Maybe the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him all night. "Dad, please." $2 million, I said, picking up the bank statement again. "Your grandparents worked their entire lives to leave that money. They died in a car accident on the I-10. And 3 weeks later, I signed every cent over to you because I thought," my voice caught, "I thought you'd do something good with it, something that mattered." I set the statement down and picked up the stack of medical bills again. "And here's what happened instead," I said. "Your mother is dying by inches because we can't afford to keep her alive. I'm working myself into the ground at 71 years old. We're about to be evicted and you..." I looked at him. "You ordered a $185 steak and didn't even ask your mother if she was okay." Jason put his head in his hands and wept. Amber sat frozen, her face white, her eyes darting between me and the documents and the crowd of people watching us. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I reached into the folder one more time. "There's more," I said quietly. Jason looked up, his face streaked with tears. "Dad, please, I can't..." "You need to hear this," I said. "All of it." And I pulled out the next document. Before we continue, just a quick note. Parts of the story ahead include dramatized elements added for storytelling purposes. So not every detail should be taken as literal fact. If you're enjoying the video, feel free to share it and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. And if this kind of story isn't for you, you're completely free to stop watching here. The next document I pulled from the folder wasn't about Kathy. It was about me. I held it up, a single-page medical letterhead at the top, neat-typed lines that had changed everything when I'd first read them 7 weeks ago. March 3rd, 2024. I read aloud, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt inside. "Patient Frank Sullivan, diagnosis, stage 2, prostate cancer, PSA, level 47 nanograms per milliliter." The restaurant, already silent, somehow grew quieter. Recommended treatment. I continued immediate radiation therapy and hormone treatment. Estimated cost. I paused to let that number hang in the air for a beat. $78,500. I set the paper down on top of the medical bills, the bank statement, the evidence of 3 years of suffering. "I have cancer," I said, simply looking at Jason. "I've had it since March 3rd, 7 days before your mother collapsed, and I haven't treated it. I haven't told anyone. I haven't done anything about it because..." My voice cracked slightly. "Because we didn't have $78,000. We didn't have $7,800. We barely had 78. Kathy made a sound beside me, a sharp, wounded gasp. She grabbed my arm. "Hank," she whispered, "you didn't tell me. You didn't..." "I couldn't," I said, turning to her briefly. "We couldn't afford your insulin. How was I supposed to tell you we needed another $80,000 for me?" Jason stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Dad, no," he said, his voice breaking. "You can't. You have to get treatment. You have to..." "I chose your mother over my own life," I said, cutting him off. My voice was calm now, matter of fact. "That's what you do when you love someone. You make the hard choice. You sacrifice." I picked up the cancer diagnosis and held it next to the stack of Kathy's medical bills. "This is what love looks like," I said. "Not lobster tails and designer dresses. Not Porsche Cayennes and $4,000 vacations. This." I gestured at the papers. "Sacrifice. Going without so someone else can have. That's love." I set the diagnosis down and reached into the folder one last time. And this, I said, pulling out a small stack of printed pages, is what the opposite of love looks like. Amber had been sitting very still, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. But when she saw what I was holding, her eyes went wide. "What is that?" she asked, her voice tight. I held up the first page, a printed receipt, the kind you get from an online purchase. "It's this," I said. Reading from it is from a website called babybump.com. Order date March 25th, 2024. One silicone pregnancy belly, 14-week size. Price $47.99. The crowd erupted in gasps. Amber shot to her feet. That's insane." "Is it?" I held up the second page. "This is from a website called Fake Ultrasound Generator. You upload a photo, add a date, and it creates a medical-looking ultrasound image. Free service. Takes about 5 minutes. I set both pages on the table and looked at Amber. "Your wife," I said to Jason, though I was still looking at her, "is not pregnant. She never was. That belly," I gestured toward her midsection, "is $48 worth of silicone. You're crazy." Amber's voice was shrill, now panicked. "You're making this up because you're jealous that we're successful, and you're not this tad." She put her hand on her stomach protectively, or what should have been protectively if there had been anything real to protect. But when she moved, something shifted. The belly, the fake silicone belly she'd been wearing all evening, had been held in place by an elastic band around her waist. And after 2 hours of sitting, eating, drinking wine, that elastic had loosened. When she stood up quickly, when she moved suddenly, when she tried to gesture indignantly, it slipped, just an inch, maybe 2. But it was enough. The bottom edge of the silicone belly separated from her actual stomach. And in the space between, in that small gap, visible to everyone at the surrounding tables, to everyone with a phone pointed at us, we could all see it. The prosthetic, the fake, the lie. Someone screamed, not loud, a sharp intake of breath that turned into a startled cry. Amber looked down, saw what had happened, and her face went from pale to crimson in an instant. She grabbed at the belly with both hands, trying to push it back into place, trying to smooth down her dress, trying to hide what everyone had already seen. But it was too late. The phone's 30-40 of them, maybe more, zoomed in, captured it, the silicone edge, the gap, the proof. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "She faked it," another voice said. The pregnancy was fake. The whispers spread like wildfire. Amber stood there, hands pressed to her stomach, her face burning, red tears starting to stream down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of sadness. These were tears of humiliation, of being caught, of having nowhere left to hide. "I can't explain," she said, her voice breaking. It's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," I said quietly. I picked up the receipts again and held them higher so the crowd could see. 14 weeks pregnant, I said. "That's what you told us tonight. That's what you told Kathy while she cried tears of joy thinking she was going to be a grandmother." I looked at Amber. "You lied. You bought a $48 prop, and you lied to a dying woman about the one thing that might have brought her comfort." Amber opened her mouth, closed. It opened it again. No words came out. I wasn't done. "I heard you," I said, turning back to Jason. 8 weeks ago, at the hospital, when your mother was in the ICU fighting for her life." Jason's face went gray. "I heard you in the hallway." I continued, my voice dropping lower, colder. "Talking to her?" I gestured at Amber. "About your mother's life insurance policy, $50,000. And I heard you say," I had to pause, had to force the words out. "I heard you say that you just had to wait. Wait for her to pass. Wait for the insurance money." "No," Jason whispered. "Dad, no, I didn't mean." "You asked how much longer she had," I said. "And she," I looked at Amber, said maybe a year, maybe less. "And you both agreed to wait." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Jason sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face. His shoulders shook. He was sobbing huge racking sobs that shook his whole body. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know how God, what have I done? What have I done?" Kathy stood up beside me. Her hand found mine and squeezed so hard it hurt. "We're leaving," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, strong. "Hank, let's go." I put my arm around her waist, supporting her weight as she swayed slightly. The ulcer on her foot had bled through the bandage through her stocking. I could feel her trembling against me. But she stood, She stood with her head up her shoulders back, and she looked at her son, at the man weeping into his hands with something that might have been pity, or grief, or both. "Goodbye, Jason," she said softly. And then we turned to leave. For 5 seconds, 5 long, suspended seconds, the restaurant was absolutely silent. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the phone stayed motionless, capturing the moment in frozen stillness. And then from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, one person started clapping. Slow, deliberate. A single pair of hands coming together in applause. Then another person joined in. An older woman, 2 tables to our left. She set down her wineglass and brought her hands together, firm, deliberate claps that echoed through the silence. Then another. A man near the bar still holding his drink in one hand, clapping with the other against his thigh. Then 10 people, 20, 30, and then everyone. The entire restaurant, every table in our section, spreading outward like a wave, rose to their feet. 80 people, maybe more, standing, applauding. Not the polite golf clap of a business dinner. Real applause, the kind that comes from somewhere deep. The sound was overwhelming. I stood there with my arm around Kathy, both of us frozen, and listened to an entire room of strangers tell us that they'd seen what happened, that they'd witnessed it, that we weren't alone. "You're a good man, sir," the man at the next table said, his voice thick. He was maybe 60, gray-haired, wearing a suit that had probably cost more than my car. "A damn good man." "God bless you both," a woman called out from somewhere behind us. "You did the right thing," another voice said. "We're praying for you." The voices came from everywhere, overlapping, sincere. People I'd never met. People who'd just watched me expose my son's cruelty and my daughter-in-law's lies in front of 100 witnesses. And instead of looking away, instead of going back to their meals and pretending they hadn't seen, they were standing, applauding, blessing us. I felt Kathy sag against me, and I held her tighter. That's when Miguel stepped forward. He'd been standing near the bar, hands clasped in front of him, watching the ovation with tears streaming down his face. Now he walked toward us through the crowd, and the crowd parted for him, creating a path. When he reached our table, he stopped and looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were red, his face wet. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I need to tell you something." I nodded, unable to speak. "I know who you are," Miguel said. "I've known since you walked in tonight, since I saw that scar on your hand." He gestured at my right hand, at the silvered line of burned tissue running from my knuckles to my wrist. 1994, Miguel continued. "August 17th, there was a warehouse fire on East Van Buren Street. Do you remember? I stared at him. Yes, I remember. My father was in that warehouse," Miguel said. "Roberto Alvarez, he was a maintenance worker. The fire started in the electrical room, and he was checking the breakers when the whole system went up. A beam fell, pinned him. The memory came back in pieces. The warehouse. The smoke so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The calls for help. The man trapped under steel and concrete flames spreading fast. You went in," Miguel said, his voice breaking. "The other firefighters said it was too dangerous. The building was coming down. But you went in anyway. I remembered grabbing that beam, remembered the heat even through my gloves, remembered the way my right hand had burned when I'd finally gotten enough leverage to shift it. You pulled him out," Miguel said. "You carried him out of that building 30 seconds before the roof collapsed. The doctor said he had second-degree burns and smoke damage to his lungs, but he lived. He lived another 25 years. My throat was tight. He passed 2019, Miguel said, nodding. The lung damage from the smoke finally caught up with him. But Mr. Sullivan, he stepped closer. He talked about you every single day. Every day for 25 years, he told us about the firefighter who saved his life. The man who didn't give up when everyone else said it was too late. You were a hero to our family, to my father, to me. I felt something break loose inside me, something I'd been holding tight for months, maybe years. I didn't know, I managed. I never knew what happened to him after. We pulled so many people out over the years. He knew, Miguel said. He never forgot. Miguel reached into his jacket and pulled out a check. He handed it to me. This is from the restaurant, he said. $5,000. It's not enough. It's not even close to enough. But it's what I can give you tonight. I looked down at the check. $5,000. Enough to pay the rent we owed. Enough to buy Kathy's insulin for months. Enough to breathe. I can't accept this, I said, my voice hoarse. You can, Miguel said firmly. You will, and there's more. He pulled out a small card laminated official looking and pressed it into my hand. "Free meals for life," he said. "You and Mrs. Sullivan, anytime, for as long as this restaurant stands. It's the least we can do." Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. The same envelope I'd given him at 3 o'clock that afternoon. "And this," Miguel said, "is your $600. Your rent money, I'm giving it back." I stared at the envelope. "But the bill was less than I expected," Miguel said, smiling through his tears. "And even if it wasn't Mr. Sullivan, you saved my father's life. You gave me 25 more years with him. 25 years of birthdays and holidays and conversations. You gave me time I never would have had." He pressed the envelope into my hand. "Take it," he said. "Please, let me do this one thing." The applause was still going, still building. People were crying now, not just us, but strangers at tables across the room. The woman at table 12, Rachel, though I still didn't know her name, had her phone down, wiping tears from her eyes. I looked at Miguel, at this man whose father I'd pulled from a burning building 30 years ago. This man who'd helped me tonight without knowing why. This man who'd given me back my dignity and more. And I broke. The tears I'd been holding back all night, all month, all year finally came. They poured out of me in great shaking sobs that I couldn't control. I pulled Miguel into a hug and held on like he was the only thing keeping me upright. "Thank you," I managed between gasps. "Thank you." Miguel hugged me back hard. "No, Mr. Sullivan, thank you. Thank you for my father. Thank you for everything." When I finally let go, I turned to Kathy. She was crying too, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "Let's go home," I said softly, putting my arm around her waist. She nodded, unable to speak. The crowd was still applauding as we walked toward the exit. They parted for us, creating a path through the tables, through the witnesses, through the phones still recording. People reached out to touch my shoulder, Kathy's hand, offering blessings and comfort as we passed. I looked back once. Jason sat at the table with his head in his hands, his whole body shaking with sobs. Amber sat beside him, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. The folder full of documents still lay spread across the white tablecloth, evidence of everything we'd lost, everything they'd taken, everything that had finally been exposed. Neither of them looked up as we left. Miguel walked us to the door. The applause followed us all the way, echoing off the walls, filling the space with sound, and then we were outside. The cool Arizona night air hit my face like a blessing. The parking lot was quiet, no voices, no phones, no witnesses. Just the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of wind through the palm trees. Kathy leaned against me heavily, and I held her up. We stood there for a moment, breathing, letting the silence wash over us. "It's over," she whispered. I kissed the top of her head. "It's over," and for the first time in 3 years, I believed it might actually be true. We'd barely made it to the car when I heard footsteps running behind us. "And that, please," Jason's voice desperate and broken. I kept walking, my arm steady around Kathy's waist, supporting her weight as she limped toward the Honda. The parking lot was dim, just a few streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The air was cool now, almost cold after the warmth of the restaurant. "Hey, Dad, please just let me explain." I turned around. Jason stood 10 feet away, breathing hard. His expensive suit wrinkled his face, streaked with tears that hadn't stopped. Behind him, Amber appeared, moving slower, her arms wrapped around herself. She'd taken off the fake belly. Without it, her dress hung loose and shapeless. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. "There's nothing to explain," I said quietly. "You made yourself very clear in there." "I didn't mean," Jason's voice cracked. "I wasn't thinking. I didn't understand how bad things were." "You didn't ask," I said. The same words from inside. They were still true. "You had 16 years to ask. 16 years to wonder what happened to $2 million. 16 years to check on your mother." Jason flinched like I'd struck him. Amber stepped forward. "This is just a misunderstanding," she said, but her voice lacked conviction now. The confidence from dinner was gone. "We can work this out. We can—" "No," I said. "We can't and we won't." I turned back to the car, fishing my keys from my pocket. Opened Kathy's door first, helped her into the passenger seat. Her hands were still shaking. The stain on her stocking had spread wider. "Fine." Amber's voice rose sharp and angry. "You want the truth? Yes, I'm in debt. $230,000 in credit cards and personal loans. I needed that inheritance money. I needed—" Jason spun around to face her. "What? $230,000? Amber repeated, her voice shrill now. "The business is failing. Derek's been stealing from you for years, and I've been trying to keep us afloat while you... You never told me, Jason said, his voice hollow. You said we were fine. You said... Your parents were going to leave it to you anyway, Amber shouted. The insurance money, the house, everything. Why should they keep it when we need it now? The way she said it, like Kathy and I were just obstacles, just things standing between them, and money they had already decided was theirs. Jason stared at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, Get away from me. Jason, we're done, he said. Whatever we were, whatever I thought we had, it's done. Get away from me. Amber's face contorted anger and desperation, and something that might have been fear. She looked at him, then at me, then at Kathy sitting in the car, and then she lunged for Kathy's door handle. You did this, she screamed. You ruined everything. I stepped between her and the car, my hand on the lock button. The door clicked shut just as her fingers reached the handle. Don't, I said. My voice was low, calm, the same voice I'd used 30 years ago, talking people down from ledges. Don't touch her. Amber backed away, her face-red tears streaming down her cheeks now. Not the dignified tears Kathy had cried. These were ugly tears, tears of rage and humiliation and defeat. I got into the driver's seat, started the Honda. That grinding noise again, the transmission that needed fixing, but tonight it sounded like freedom. Jason stood in the parking lot watching us. He raised one hand halfway between a wave and a plea, but I didn't acknowledge it, just shifted into reverse and backed out of the space. As we drove away, I saw him in the rearview mirror, still standing there, still alone. Kathy reached over and took my hand. We drove home in silence, her fingers wrapped tight around mine, and neither of us said a word. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until days later, was what happened after we left. The woman from table 12, Rachel, the one who'd been recording everything on her phone. At 10:17 that night, she uploaded the video, not to her personal page, to the main feed of one of those viral video platforms, the kind where stories explode overnight, where ordinary moments become national news. She titled it, Son Refuses to Pay for Dying Mother on Mother's Day, Watch What Happens. Added hashtags, hashtag Mother's Day Shame, hashtag Fake Pregnancy, hashtag Inheritance Lie. She'd edited it down from the full 18 minutes to just 4.5. The key moments, Amber's line about not paying for her, the prepayment reveal, the medical bills, the cancer diagnosis, the fake belly slipping, the standing ovation, everything. By 11 that night, the video had 1 million views. By 2 in the morning, on May 13th, it had 10 million. By 8 o'clock, less than 12 hours after it was posted, it had 40 million views and was trending #1 nationwide. The algorithm had picked it up. The story was too perfect, too outrageous. Mother's Day, a dying woman, a fake pregnancy, a $2 million inheritance, public humiliation at an upscale restaurant. It had everything. People shared it, commented, made reaction videos. The hashtags trended on every platform. By that Monday morning, the national news had picked it up. CNN ran a segment. Fox covered it. MSNBC did a whole segment on elder financial abuse. The clips played on morning shows, afternoon talk shows, evening news. The story was everywhere. And with the attention came consequences. The FBI opened an investigation that same day. Wire fraud, elder financial abuse. The video was evidence clear, documented, witnessed by dozens. They started with Amber's fake pregnancy scheme, her debt, the life insurance conversation I'd mentioned. But then they found Derek, Jason's business partner, the one who'd been calling during dinner, the one who'd been stealing for years, as Amber had said in the parking lot. The investigators pulled the company records, found $3.2 million missing, embezzled over 4 years through fake vendor contracts and inflated expenses. Derek had been bleeding the business dry, while Jason, distracted, oblivious, had signed off on everything without looking. The dominoes were falling, and they were falling fast. I didn't watch the video. Not then, not later, not ever. I knew what had happened in that restaurant. I didn't need to see it again. Didn't need to read the comments or watch the reactions or become part of the spectacle. When the news vans showed up at our house 3 days later, I didn't answer the door. When reporters called, I hung up. When the story hit the national news, I turned off the TV, because none of that mattered. What mattered was Kathy. I spent that first night after the restaurant cleaning and dressing the ulcer on her foot. It took 40 minutes. The wound was deep, infected, worse than I'd thought. but I cleaned it carefully, applied fresh bandages, elevated her leg on pillows. She watched me the whole time, tears sliding quietly down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what? For being a burden, for costing so much, for—" "Stop," I said, looking up at her. "You're not a burden. You never were. You're my wife, and I love you." She reached down and touched my face. "What do we do now?" I took her hand and kissed her palm. "We rest, we heal, we take care of each other. And Jason—" I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "That's up to him now." The TV stayed off that night. The phone stayed silent. The world outside could wait. For now, there was just us, just Kathy and me, just the two of us trying to survive another day. And that was enough. 3 days passed in quiet. Kathy and I stayed home. I dressed her ulcer twice a day, drove her to a clinic appointment I could barely afford, picked up her medications with the money Miguel had given us. We didn't watch the news, didn't answer calls from numbers we didn't recognize, didn't open the door when reporters knocked. Just us, healing, surviving. On the 3rd day, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but then I saw the name on the screen, Jason. I stared at it for 3 rings, 4, then I picked up. "Dad." His voice was hoarse, broken. "Can we talk? Please, I know I don't deserve it, but please." I was quiet for a long moment. Then I said, "Come to the house, tomorrow, May 18th, 2 in the afternoon. Jason pulled up in his Porsche, the same one from Mother's Day. But when he got out, he looked different. No suit, just jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt. His eyes were red and swollen like he hadn't slept in days. I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd signed over $2 million 16 years ago. "I found something," Jason said quietly. His hands were shaking. "Yesterday, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about the cancer. So, I went to your house. I know I shouldn't have, but I needed to know." He pulled out a stack of papers, my cancer bills, the ones I'd hidden in the glove box of my truck, the diagnosis from March 3rd, the treatment plan, the cost estimate, all of it. At $78,500. Jason read, his voice cracking. "Stage 2, and you didn't tell anyone. You didn't get treatment? You just—" He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. "You chose Mom over yourself." I said nothing. "And then I found this," Jason continued. He pulled out a small spiral notebook, the kind you buy at the dollar store. Kathy's handwriting covered the pages. Dates, times, insulin doses. Jason opened to a page dated March 8th, 2 days before her collapse. "Half dose again." He read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "God forgive me for what I'm doing, but we can't afford the full amount. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week." He turned the page. March 9th. "Half dose. Hank doesn't know I'm cutting back this much. I can't tell him. He'd give me his last dollar and we need it for rent." Jason's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the notebook. "She wrote this every day," he said. "For months, cutting her doses, apologizing to God, trying to survive." He looked at me, and I was at a spa, getting a massage, ordering lobster, buying Amber whatever she wanted. He set the notebook down and put his head in his hands. "What have I done?" he whispered. "Dad, what have I done? I was so blind, so stupid. I thought I was successful. I thought I had everything figured out. And you were dying. Mom was dying. And I didn't even notice." He looked up at me, his face destroyed. "I chose money over you," he said. "I chose my wife and my business and my reputation over my own parents. How do I live with that? How do I—" He broke, completely. His whole body shook with sobs. I got up from my chair, walked around the table, and pulled my son into my arms. He clung to me like he was drowning, like I was the only thing keeping him above water. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "I'm so sorry, Dad, I'm sorry." "I know," I said quietly. "I know you are." We stood there for a long time, father and son, trying to find our way back to each other. The next day, May 19th, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a woman standing on my porch, mid to late 40s, dark hair, familiar somehow, though I couldn't place where I'd seen her. Then I remembered, table 12, the restaurant, the woman who'd been recording everything. "Mr. Sullivan," she said softly. "My name is Rachel Martinez. Can I talk to you for a moment?" I let her in. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same spot Jason had sat the day before, and pulled an old photograph from her purse. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." She slid the photo across the table. It showed a man, maybe 60, gray hair, kind eyes, standing with his arm around a teenage girl. The girl had dark hair and a nervous smile. Written on the back in faded ink, Dad and Rachel, 1995. I looked at the man in the photo, looked at his face, and felt the world tilt. It was my father. We share a father, Rachel said quietly. Your father was my father too. He and my mother were together before he met your mother. I was born in 1976. He stayed in my life. Not full time, but he was there. He loved me, and he loved you. I stared at her, at this woman who looked so familiar, who had the same eyes as my father, the same slight curve to her mouth. I found out about you when I was 16, Rachel continued. He told me, said I had a half-brother, a firefighter, a good man, but he also said your mother didn't know about me, that it would hurt her to find out. So I stayed away. Why now? I managed. Because I saw the video, Rachel said simply. I was at that restaurant because it was my father's favorite place. Miguel, his son, your father saved his father. He told me about a man who was coming in, a firefighter named Sullivan, and I thought, maybe it was you. She reached across the table and took my hand. I recorded everything because I knew something important was happening, she said. And when I saw what your son did to you, what his wife did, I couldn't just sit there. I had to do something. So I posted the video, and I made sure the world saw what I saw, a good man who'd been forgotten by the people who should have loved him most. Tears were running down my face now. You're my sister, I said. I'm your sister, Rachel confirmed. And I'm not going anywhere. Not anymore. I stood up and hugged her. This stranger who wasn't a stranger. This sister I'd never known I had. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The next day, Jason called me again. Dad, I did something, he said. I started a fundraiser online. It's called Help My Parents After I Failed Them. He'd launched it on one of those crowdfunding sites. Set the goal at $250,000, enough to cover the medical debts, the cancer treatment, everything. Within 24 hours, it had raised $180,000. The video had gone everywhere, 40 million views, and people were responding, donating, sharing, leaving comments about their own parents, their own regrets. By August, the total was $427,000. Jason paid off Kathy's medical debt on June 15th. Every cent of the $146,300. He paid for my cancer treatment on June 20th, $78,500. The hospital scheduled me for radiation immediately. He bought Kathy an insulin pump on July 10th, $18,000. It changed her life overnight. And he did something else. He moved back home, sold his Porsche, sold the house he and Amber had bought, filed for divorce, walked away from the business with Derek, let the authorities handle it. And he came home. Every morning he drove us to appointments. Every afternoon he helped Kathy with her medications. Every evening he cooked dinner, simple food, nothing fancy, just chicken and vegetables and conversation. Rachel came by 3 times a week. She was a nurse, had been for 20 years, and she helped with the medical care Kathy needed, changed dressings, monitored glucose, taught Jason how to do it right. In June, I started radiation treatment for the cancer. 35 sessions, 5 days a week, 7 weeks total. Jason drove me to every single one. And every night he stayed, slept on our couch, made breakfast in the morning. He was trying, really trying. And slowly, so slowly, I almost didn't notice at first we started to heal. Not just our bodies, our family. September 15th, 2024. 6 weeks after Mother's Day. 2 FBI agents knocked on Amber's apartment door at dawn. I wasn't there. I read about it 2 days later in the Arizona Republic. The headline ran across page 3, "Influencer arrested after viral Mother's Day video." The charges were straightforward wire fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and criminal harassment. Bail was set at $100,000, an amount Amber, despite the designer clothes and the Porsche lease, couldn't produce. She'd spent it all. The credit card companies had already begun collections. She sat in Maricopa County's 4th Avenue jail awaiting trial. I folded the newspaper and set it beside my coffee. Kathy asked if I felt relieved. I told her I didn't know what I felt. October 10th, 2024. A month later, the Maricopa County grand jury returned a superseding indictment, 12 counts in total. The video had been analyzed frame by frame, the fake pregnancy belly, the blank card 2 weeks prior, the refusal to pay the insurance conversation Jason had overheard in March. Everything was documented. The internet had done the investigators' jobs for them. That same afternoon, Derek Hartman, Jason's business partner, was arrested at his home in Paradise Valley. Federal prosecutors charged him with embezzling $3.2 million over 4 years. Jason had provided the forensic accounting reports his attorney uncovered during the business audit. Derek's Bentley, his second home in Sedona, his wife's jewelry, it all came from money that should have been Jason's. Jason called me that night. His voice was flat. "They got Derek." I heard. "He stole everything, Dad. Everything I was supposed to build for you and Mom." I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "You're building it now." There was a long silence on the line. Finally, Jason whispered, "Yeah, I am." December 15th, 2024. 3 months after the arrest, the trial began in the Sandra Day O'Connor U.S. Courthouse in downtown Phoenix. I did not attend. Neither did Kathy. Our part in the story was over. Jason went, though. He sat in the back row every day alone. The trial lasted only 4 days. Amber's public defender, a sharp young woman named Carla Mendez, had advised her to plead guilty. The video evidence was insurmountable. 40 million people had watched Amber refuse to pay for a dying woman's dinner on Mother's Day. The jury pool had been poisoned by fury long before voir dire began. A plea deal, Mendez argued, was the only path to a lighter sentence. Amber refused at first. She wanted to fight. But on day 3 after the prosecution played the full 18-minute raw video in open court, including the moment she'd laughed and said, "At your age, simple is best," she changed her mind. On the 4th day, she stood before Judge Patricia Moreno and entered a guilty plea on all 12 counts. Judge Moreno did not smile. She'd seen the video. So had her clerks, her bailiff, and half the courthouse staff. The judge asked Amber if she understood that she was waiving her right to trial. Amber said yes. The judge asked if anyone had coerced her. Amber said no. Then Judge Moreno read the sentence. 5 years in federal prison, no parole. Restitution of $230,000 to be paid upon release. 3 years of supervised probation after incarceration. Mandatory financial counseling. A permanent ban from holding fiduciary responsibility over anyone aged 65 or older. Amber stood motionless. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder. The judge struck her gavel once, and it was over. Derek Hartman's sentencing came the following week. 8 years. No possibility of early release. He didn't fight it either. The accounting records were irrefutable. I learned all of this from the newspaper. Jason sent me a text message after Amber's sentencing. It said, "It's done." I replied, "How are you?" He didn't answer for 6 hours. When he finally did, he wrote, "I don't know, Dad. I really don't know." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper spread in front of me. The headline read, "Guilty Verdict in Mother's Day Elder Abuse Case, 5 years for Influencer." There was a photo of Amber being led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, her head down, her hair covering her face. I stared at that photo for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved. I felt tired and sad. Sad for Jason, who'd loved a woman who'd tried to harm his mother through neglect. Sad for Amber, who'd traded her future for handbags and restaurant bills. Sad for the waste of it all. Kathy's voice drifted in from the living room. "Hank, you coming to bed?" "In a minute," I called back. I folded the newspaper carefully, creasing it along the center line. Then I walked into the living room. Kathy had fallen asleep on the couch, her head resting against a pillow Jason had bought her last month. Soft, hypoallergenic, the kind that didn't irritate her skin. Her insulin pump was clipped to her waistband. Her foot, now healed, rested on a cushion. I sat down beside her and took her hand. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. Outside, the December night was cool and still. Somewhere across town, my son was probably sitting in his apartment, staring at his phone, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Somewhere in a federal holding facility, Amber was beginning to understand the cost of cruelty. And somewhere in a distant cell, Derek was doing the same. But here in this small living room, my wife was breathing steadily, her hand warm in mine. I closed my eyes. Justice had been served. The law had spoken. But none of that mattered as much as this Kathy was alive. Jason was home. And for the first time in years, I believed we might actually be okay. I squeezed her hand gently, and I let myself rest. June 2025, 13 months after that Mother's Day dinner. 6 months after Amber's sentencing, I sat in Dr. Sarah Morrison's exam room with Kathy beside me. The waiting room had been full of families, children playing with toys, a young mother cradling a newborn. The world kept turning. Life kept happening. And somehow, against all odds, we were still here. Dr. Morrison walked in with 2 thick folders under her arm. She smiled the kind of smile doctors give when the news is better than expected. "Hank," she said, setting the folders on the counter, "your PSA is .8. I blinked. .8, down from 47 in March of last year. 35 radiation treatments completed in September. No detectable masses on your latest scan. I'm calling it complete remission." Kathy squeezed my hand so hard, I felt her wedding ring press into my skin. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I'd spent a year preparing myself for the opposite news, for the conversation about palliative care, about months instead of years. I'd made peace with it, but here I was, still breathing, still fighting. "Well, thank you," I finally managed. Dr. Morrison turned to Kathy. "And you, Mrs. Sullivan, your A1C is 7.2%. Kathy's eyes widened. 7, down from 10.2 last March. Your glucose levels have been stable for 3 months straight. The insulin pump is working beautifully, and the continuous monitor Jason set up," she gestured to the small device clipped to Kathy's arm, "has been logging every reading. You're doing everything right." Kathy looked down at her hands. "Jason did that," she said quietly. "He checks it every morning, every night. He sets alarms on his phone so he doesn't forget." Dr. Morrison nodded. "I know. He calls me twice a week with questions." Then she knelt beside Kathy's chair and gently lifted her right foot, the one that had bled through her stocking on Mother's Day. She peeled back the bandage. Underneath the skin was smooth, pink, new. "This," Dr. Morrison said softly, "is what I call a miracle." Kathy stared at her foot as if seeing it for the first time. The ulcer, the one that had wept for months, the one that had turned black at the edges, the one I'd been so sure would take her leg, was gone, completely healed. "Your son cleaned this wound every single day," Dr. Morrison continued. "He followed the protocol exactly. He changed dressings. He monitored for infection. He drove you to every follow-up appointment. Mrs. Sullivan, wounds like this don't heal without that kind of care. Jason saved your foot." Kathy's tears came silently the way they always did. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders. Dr. Morrison stood and made a note in her chart. "Your peripheral neuropathy has improved by about 60%. The nerve damage from years of high glucose is reversing. Slowly, but it's happening. Keep doing what you're doing." "We will," I said. After the appointment, we drove home through midday Phoenix traffic. The June heat shimmered off the asphalt. Kathy rested her head against the window, her whole healed foot propped on the seat. She didn't say much, neither did I. Some things were too big for words. When we pulled into the driveway, Rachel's car was already there. She'd started coming by 3 times a week sometimes to check Kathy's vitals, sometimes just to sit and talk. She'd brought flowers today, daisies, Kathy's favorite. Inside, Rachel was setting the table for lunch. She looked up when we walked in and grinned. "How'd it go?" "Remission," I said. Rachel's grin widened. "I knew it. And Kathy's A1C is 7.2. Rachel crossed the room and hugged Kathy so tightly I thought she might lift her off the ground. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Kathy laughed, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard in years. "I didn't do anything. Jason did it all." "You let him," Rachel said. "That's something." Jason had sold the mansion in Paradise Valley back in February. The Porsche Cayenne was gone to repossessed, actually, since it had been leased in Amber's name. He'd moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Tempe near the university. No granite countertops, no chandeliers, just a couch, a bed, and a desk. He'd taken a job as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm. $85,000 a year, a fraction of what he'd once made, but honest work. He showed up at our house every morning before work to check Kathy's glucose and make sure she'd eaten breakfast. Every evening he came back to cook dinner. On weekends he cleaned the house, fixed anything that was broken, and drove us to appointments. He never asked for forgiveness. He just worked. And slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice it happening, I started to trust him again. That evening my phone rang. Jason's name lit up the screen. "Hey, Dad." "Jason." He paused. I could hear him breathing on the other end. "I wanted to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Mother's Day is next Sunday. I know last year was..." He trailed off. I waited. "I want to cook dinner for you and Mom," he said finally. "At my place. Nothing fancy, just the 3 of us. And Rachel if she wants to come. His voice cracked. "I want to do it right this time. I looked across the room at Kathy, who was watching me with those steady, knowing eyes. "We'll be there," I said. Jason exhaled a sound like relief, like release. "Thank you, Dad." "Jason, yeah, we're proud of you." There was a long silence. Then quietly, "I'm trying." "I know you are." After I hung up, I sat down beside Kathy on the couch. She rested her head on my shoulder. "He's really coming back, isn't he?" she whispered. I thought about the last 13 months, the hospital bills paid in full, the insulin pump, the 35 radiation appointments Jason had driven me to, even when I told him I could take a cab, the dressings he'd changed, the phone calls to Dr. Morrison, the quiet, relentless work of rebuilding a life. I kissed the top of Kathy's head. "Yeah," I said, "our son has truly come home." May 11th, 2025. Sunday morning 1 year, and one day after the dinner that changed everything. I woke to silence. Not the heavy, anxious silence of the year before, but the kind that settles over a house when the storm has finally passed. Kathy was still asleep beside me, her breathing steady, her hand resting on the pillow between us. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. The world outside was calm. For the first time in 3 years, I felt at peace. We arrived at Jason's apartment a little after noon. It was a small one-bedroom unit in Tempe, near the university, with a parking lot full of older sedans and a stairwell that smelled faintly of laundry detergent. Rachel pulled up at the same time we did, carrying a bouquet of daisies and a loaf of homemade bread wrapped in foil. "You ready?" she asked, smiling at us. Kathy squeezed my hand. "I think so." Jason opened the door before we could knock. He was wearing jeans and a plain blue shirt, no designer labels, no tailored fit. His hair was a little longer than it used to be. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. "Hey, Mom, Dad," he stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was modest, a couch from a thrift store, a small dining table with 4 mismatched chairs, bookshelves made from cinder blocks and planks. The kitchen was tiny, barely big enough for one person, but Jason had somehow managed to cook an entire meal in it. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the space. On the table sat 4 plates, white IKEA ceramics, the kind that cost $1 each, and a small vase holding grocery store carnations. No crystal, no linen napkins, no $142 bottles of wine. It was perfect. Rachel set the daisies beside the carnations and hugged Jason tightly. "It smells amazing in here." Jason smiled, a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen on his face in years. "I've been cooking since 6 this morning. I'm pretty sure I burned the potatoes twice." Kathy laughed. "I'm sure they're wonderful." We sat down together. Jason brought out the food roasted chicken with rosemary mashed potatoes, only slightly scorched at the edges, steamed green beans, and a salad. It wasn't Mastro's. It wasn't fancy, but every bite had been made with care. For the first hour, we just talked. About small things, Rachel's patients at the hospital, Kathy's new knitting project, the book I'd been reading. Jason told us about his job, about the team he was managing, about a difficult project that had finally come together. He spoke with a kind of quiet pride I hadn't heard from him before, the pride that comes from doing something hard and doing it well. Rachel teased him about his cooking. Kathy told embarrassing stories from Jason's childhood, and I just listened. I listened to my family whole again, sitting around a cheap table in a small apartment, and I realized this was what I'd been fighting for all along. At 2 o'clock, after we'd finished eating and cleared the plates, Jason stood and walked to the kitchen counter. He picked up a thick manila envelope and brought it back to the table. His hands were shaking slightly as he set it down in front of me. "Dad," he said quietly, "I need you to open this." I looked at Kathy. She nodded. I picked up the envelope and pulled out the contents. Inside were receipts, dozens of them, each one stamped "Paid in full." Phoenix Multi-Specialty Hospital, $12,847. Paid. Valley Cancer Center, $78,500. Paid. Diabetes. Supply Company, $18,000. Paid. Southwest Cardiology, $7,200. Paid. Community Health Pharmacy, $27,000. Paid. I kept flipping through them, page after page, bill after bill, every single one marked the same way. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten summary in Jason's blocky script. Total debts paid $253,800. GoFundMe total raised $427,000. Remaining funds $173,200 invested for Mom and Dad's future care. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. Kathy leaned over my shoulder reading with me. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. "Jason," she whispered. "It's done, Mom." Jason's voice cracked. "All of it. Everything. You don't owe anyone anything anymore." I set the papers down carefully, as if they might disintegrate if I moved too fast. Then I reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out the last item, a folded letter written on lined notebook paper. "Dear Mom and Dad," it began. I read it silently at first. Then, because Kathy was crying too hard to focus, I read it aloud. "Dear Mom and Dad, I don't know if I'll ever be able to say the right words. I've tried writing this letter 100 times, and every version feels like it's not enough. But I'm going to try anyway. A year ago, I was the worst version of myself. I was selfish. I was blind. I was cruel. I stood in a restaurant and let my wife humiliate you, and I did nothing. I watched you suffer, and I turned away. I took the money you gave me, money that came from Grandma and Grandpa, money that was supposed to build a future, and I let it slip through my fingers. I let someone steal it. I let someone spend it, and I never once asked you if you were okay. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't see Mom's illness. I'm sorry I didn't see Dad's treatment bills. I'm sorry I didn't see that you were giving up everything, your health, your home, your dignity, just to survive. I'm sorry I believed that money was the same thing as love. I'm sorry I forgot what you taught me. Dad, you told me once that the measure of a man isn't what he earns. It's what he gives. You gave me everything. You gave me life. You gave me a home. You gave me a future. And when I lost it all, you still gave me a second chance. I know I can't undo the past year. I can't take back the things Amber said. I can't erase the hurt. But I can promise you this, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you raised me to be. I will take care of you the way you took care of me. I will show up. I will ask questions. I will listen, and I will never ever forget what you sacrificed for me. I love you both, more than I know how to say. Jason. By the time I finished reading, my voice was shaking. Kathy was sobbing. Rachel had tears streaming down her face. Jason sat across from us, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I folded the letter carefully and set it on top of the receipts. Then I stood, walked around the table, and pulled my son into my arms. "You're a good man, Jason," I said quietly. "You're a good man." He held on to me like he was drowning. "I'm trying, Dad. I'm trying so hard." "I know you are, and I'm proud of you." Kathy joined us, wrapping her arms around both of us. Rachel stood too, hesitating for only a second before stepping into the circle. The four of us stood there in that tiny apartment holding each other, letting the weight of the last year finally lift. At 5 o'clock, we moved to the small patio outside Jason's apartment. It overlooked a dusty parking lot and a chain-link fence, but beyond that, the sky was turning gold and pink as the sun began to set. Jason had brought out folding chairs. We sat together watching the light change, saying nothing. Kathy rested her head on my shoulder. Rachel sat beside Jason, her hand on his arm. The air was warm. The world was quiet. I thought about the inheritance I'd given Jason all those years ago. $2 million, a fortune. Gone now, most of it spent, stolen, wasted. For so long I'd believed that money was the legacy I was supposed to leave behind, the thing that would prove I'd done something with my life. But I'd been wrong. The real inheritance wasn't money. It was this. It was sitting on a patio with the people you love, watching the sun go down, knowing that you'd survived the worst and come out whole. It was forgiveness. It was second chances. It was learning that the value of a man isn't what he owns, it's who he becomes when he loses everything. Jason had lost everything, and he'd become the man I always hoped he would be. Kathy stirred beside me. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. I looked at her, at the woman who'd stood beside me for 48 years, through pneumonia and warehouse fires and hospital bills and betrayal. At Rachel, who'd found us when we needed her most. At Jason, who'd fallen and gotten back up. "I'm thinking," I said, "that we made it." Kathy smiled. "Yeah, we did." The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. The day was ending, but we were still here. And that was the legacy I'd leave behind. Not money, not houses, not cars, just love, just family, just this. I squeezed Kathy's hand. "We made it," I whispered again. And I knew deep in my bones that it was true. Looking back now, sitting in the quiet of my living room, with Kathy asleep beside me, I realized that this family story wasn't just about money or illness or even betrayal. It was about what happens when we forget to ask the people we love. A simple question. Are you okay? I don't tell you this story to make you pity me or to paint myself as a hero. I tell it because I've learned something in my 71 years on this earth, and I hope, God willing, that it might spare someone else the pain we went through. Don't be like me. Don't wait until you're sitting in a restaurant on Mother's Day, watching your son nod along as his wife humiliates your dying spouse to realize you've lost him. Don't assume that silence means everything is fine. Don't convince yourself that your children will remember your sacrifices without being reminded what those sacrifices cost. Family betrayal is a quiet killer. It doesn't announce itself with grand gestures. It starts small: a missed phone call, an unanswered text, a dinner invitation declined one too many times. It grows in the space between "I'm fine" and the truth. And before you know it, the people you raised, the ones you gave everything for, have become strangers who see you as an obligation rather than a gift. But here's the lesson I want you to take from this family story. Betrayal is not the end. Redemption is possible. Forgiveness is possible. But only if both sides are willing to do the hardest work of all, showing up every single day and choosing love over pride. Jason could have walked away after that night at Mastro's. He could have blamed me for embarrassing him, for ruining his marriage, for exposing his failures in front of 40 million strangers. But he didn't. He chose to come back. He chose to sit in the wreckage of his own mistakes and rebuild brick by brick the relationship he had destroyed. And I, stubborn old man that I am, chose to let him. That's my advice to you. If someone you love has committed family betrayal against you, give them a chance to make it right. Not because they deserve it, not because it's easy, but because love, real love, is not about keeping score. It's about deciding that the person in front of you is worth more than the hurt they caused. Now I'm a man of simple faith. I'm not a preacher, and I don't claim to know all the answers. But I do know this: God didn't put us on this earth to hoard our blessings, or to measure our worth by the size of our bank accounts. He put us here to love each other imperfectly, messily, desperately, and to forgive when that love is tested. So, if you're watching this and you're estranged from your parents, your children, your siblings, pick up the phone, send the text, knock on the door. Life is too short, and family betrayal cuts too deep to let pride be the thing that keeps you apart. As for me, I'm just grateful. Grateful for Kathy, who never gave up. Grateful for Jason, who found his way home. Grateful for Rachel, who reminded me that family isn't just blood. It's the people who show up when it matters. This is our family story. I pray yours ends with hope too. Thank you for walking with me through this journey to the very end. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like ours, caught between love and betrayal, between holding on and letting go? Your perspective means the world to me. If this story resonated with you or stirred something in your heart, please consider subscribing so you won't miss the stories still to come. A gentle reminder: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-life themes of family sacrifice and reconciliation, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this particular style doesn't align with your preferences, feel free to explore other content that speaks to you.